Chapter 1. The earliest recorded treatment for ADHD came from Hippocrates back in BC, who described a lot of the symptoms of a patient that are very similar to our modern understanding of ADHD. He said that they had quickened responses to sensory experience, but also less tenaciousness because the soul moves on quickly to the next impression. This can be translated as hyperactivity. So imagine that the ball is the brain, and imagine that everything else that the ball hits are either stimulus or thoughts. Point being, the brain likes to jump. It is moving quickly from one place to another. Now, if we fast forward, I'd say at least 1 or 2 years. 1987. We see that ADHD gets finally referred to as ADHD inside of the DSM-3 revised edition. Let's just say all of the other names were a bit questionable. The psychology from the 1900s were biased, to say the least. And then we finally get the modern understanding of ADHD, the DSM-5, where we separate ADHD into 3 subtypes: inattentive, hyperactive, and combined. Chapter 2. Dopamine and the reward system. Now, dopamine is known as the happy chemical of the brain. Now, let's say you're Bob Ross making some
happy little leaves. Like so.
That gives you a pleasure sensation. That gives dopamine. And dopamine is important for multiple different things. It's important on not being bored, for staying motivated, and for being focused. And ADHD people lack that chemical. Well, I mean, in medical terms, we're less reactive to dopamine because we technically make the same amount, but this makes us and people with ADHD a bunch of heat-seeking missiles for that dopamine, baby. Which is also why, whenever you have the more hyperactive part of ADHD, call back, and they'll start to fidget more. So you'll see them shake their leg or fidget with their fingers or just squirm around. However, there are sometimes consequences. I can't show video of it because I don't have a camera, but check this out. Like, I mean, come on. It's mouth harp. It make funny sound. However, not everyone buys a mouth harp to make them more entertained. Some of them do a little bit of questionable things, if you know what I mean. They do a little bit of tomfoolery. They do vapes. Because people have less dopamine, they are also at higher risk for addiction problems. CDC.gov, this is supported by NIMH.gov, and this is supported by BetterHealth.com, which all talk about the same subject. Links in description. Now, of course, there's another chemical involved with this, which is known as norepinephrine. Cliff Notes version that this chemical is your fight or flight response, and it's the chemical that helps you stay awake, pay attention, and think clearly. The final chapter, Chapter 3. Attention and the frontal lobes. Now, we understand ADHD is one thing. ADHD is obviously a deficit of attention, right? No, that's where you're incorrect. We the people don't actually lack the attention. ADHD is actually the problem with regulating your attention. And in fact, even some people with ADHD actually have too much attention on something. This is known as hyperfocus. And it's where you're focused for so long, for a long period of time, that you actually forget basic needs such as food and water. And it is also something that is happening right now. I've been editing this video since 9 o'clock, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7... for 8 hours. I have not drinking anything, I have not ate anything. We already know from earlier that people with ADHD are hypersensitive to different stimuli and focus, as displayed in the last 2 chapters, page 47 and page 13. Now, let's say that for this example, neurotypical people are on the left and ADHD people are on the right. What a neurotypical person has is a dial that goes 1 through 10. And depending on the situation, the dial will go to certain numbers. 10 being the most focused and 1 being the least focused. So you can say your amount of focus whenever you're studying for a test or studying for an assignment, versus your focus when you're watching a movie that you really like. Now, for people with ADHD, this is completely randomized. And instead of having 1 through 10, we add 1 through 15. And what 11 through 15 is the hyperfocus zone. Now, this can be influenced by how emotionally intensive a certain thing is. So if I'm watching a movie for Star Wars, it's more likely to either go to the hyperfocus zone or more likely to go through the higher numbers. Versus, let's say, I instead tried to study for an exam. My focus might go from 1 to 5 or somewhere around there. Now, let's get into the neuroscience on why this happens to people's brain in ADHD. Now, ADHD completely rewires the brain. However, it largely affects the frontal lobes, which are responsible for language, for reasoning, for communication, for impulse control, judgment. It is basically the rational part of the brain that we use. And This can be diagnosed as two different problems. The first problem is that it takes longer for the ADHD brain to mature. The second problem is neurotransmitters. Now imagine them as messengers that transmit signals from one part of the brain to another. Now what happens is that, as said in chapter 2, page 45, we see that they have a lack of both dopamine and norepinephrine. And now we're at the end. Let's do a recap of everything we learned. In chapter 1, we learned about the history of ADHD, including Hippocrates, the different names that ADHD was given, and about hyperactivity. And in chapter 2, we learned about the chemicals in our brain. In chapter 3, we learned about the frontal lobes and how the ADHD brain has a hard time regulating its focus. So all I can say is...